People get their news from a variety of sources, but they all involve agenda setting and framing. What are agenda setting and framing? Think of agenda setting as deciding what to cover and what is worth the attention of the media and the public. In a way, the most important decisions ever made by the media are not how they cover a story. There's a lot of focus on how a certain thing was phrased. It's whether they cover a story at all, whether anyone in the news organization sees the story as news. So agenda setting is one of the most important things because it determines what people talk about. It determines what's on the agenda, and therefore it's a form of setting the table for political discussion. Framing, by contrast, refers to the ways that things are actually covered. The context, stakes, and phrasing that are inserted into a news article in order to set up the story a certain way. Here's an example. Let's say that Congress just passed a large expansion of social support programs like food stamps. One news outlet could cover that as 3 million children who would have gone hungry under the old rules will now have access to nutritional benefits provided by the government under the new rules. That's a long headline, but just pretend. Another way of framing that exact same story would be federal deficit expands by $140 million because of increased entitlement spending. Both news outlets are covering the exact same story, but they are framing the story in completely different ways. One emphasizes that hungry children will have access to food because of government assistance. The other emphasizes that the US debt is likely to grow because of increased government expenditures on social support programs. Framing. You have the same picture, but you put two different frames around it, it'll look like a different picture. The prior article that we read today asked if partisan media consumption increases polarization.
Tom Riley, director of the nonpartisan Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University. He's one of the authors of a new study examining where voters get both news and commentary.
Well, voters today basically have this cafeteria type format where they can choose from personalized news sources that not only serves to inform them, but also reinforces their worldview. We want to hear stuff that we believe in, or just kind of, particularly in a very polarized world. So I do think we're seeing this, people reverting back to what they feel safe. Republicans with independent friends.
The researchers found that the proliferation of news sources on cable TV and the internet has upended the relationship between news outlets and their audiences. Instead of voters being shaped by news, Riley says news is being shaped for voters.
What we're seeing is that, particularly with a lot of the internet sources, is that they're appealing to a base. And they're attracting a wide audience, and it's growing, and they're responding to what voters want instead of vice versa.
It used to be that politicians and candidates would appeal to a base, but now you're saying that news outlets are appealing to their base.
And they're shaping, yeah.
Now you can think of it in common sense terms, and it seems to be a fairly strong hypothesis that if you consume a lot of very partisan media, that is, if a lot of your sources of news, entertainment, and internet news articles are overwhelmingly conservative or overwhelmingly liberal, then you yourself are likely to become more conservative or more liberal. But in practice, this is proven surprisingly hard to actually prove empirically with research. That's what the prior article does. It summarizes some of that research. One reason that this has been hard to figure out is a really important and fun phrase that you should know, which is correlation is not causation. Correlation is just two things moving in the same direction. They can be positively correlated, moving in the same direction, or negatively correlated, they move in opposite directions. But either way, correlation is just two things kind of moving in tandem, like two dance partners on a floor. Causation is a lot harder to prove. Causation actually refers to one thing causing another to happen. So for example, if you want to prove that cigarettes cause cancer, it's not enough to just show that people who say they smoke are more likely to get cancer, because there could be a third factor that's causing them to smoke and causing them to get cancer. Maybe say a general disregard for your health could both cause you to smoke and cause you to be more likely to get cancer, but that doesn't mean smoking causes cancer. Now, in reality, we were able to actually go in and prove by using rigorous experiments that smoking does cause cancer. You have a control group in which they don't smoke, and you have an experimental group in which they do smoke, and then you look at who gets more cancer. And if the experimental group gets more cancer, well then you have decent evidence that smoking causes cancer, assuming you've controlled for all the other relevant factors that could influence that decision. So that is the difference between correlation and causation. You gotta be very careful because sometimes things will be correlated, but they will not be caused by each other. So for example, the amount of pirate attacks in the ocean has gone way down in the last 4 centuries. But the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone way up in the last 4 centuries. And so you might look at that graph and say, oh my God, it looks like pirate attacks actually help prevent global warming. And so obviously if we want carbon emissions to go down, we need to increase the amount of pirate attacks on the world's oceans. And then we can halt global warming that way. Right? You'd be completely correct in pointing out the correlation, and you would be completely wrong about the causation. In fact, there is no causal link between pirate attacks and global warming. They're just unrelated. He's doing a lot better. The second article we had to read today was another article by Nate Silver, the statistician, who works on sports and politics. And a point that he makes in that article is that media outlets tend to be very bad at covering probability ranges. They tend to take probabilities as certainties, and they tend to imply a level of precision that is not always there. One famous example of taking a probability as a certainty came in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. 538, which is Nate Silver's election model, had Hillary Clinton as about a 70% favorite to win the election, and Donald Trump is about a 30% underdog to win the election. That means if you ran the election 100 times, Hillary Clinton would win about 70 elections, and Donald Trump would win about 30 elections. Now, we happen to live in the world where one of the 30 out of 100 chances happened. That's just how it goes. You know, if you say there's a 70% chance of a thing happening, you should expect the less probable outcome about 3 out of 10 times. That's a well-calibrated prediction. But that was generally covered as something like a 99% chance, and there was no way that Trump would ever win. That's kind of how the media covered those probabilities. And so there's sort of a weird dynamic in which when the 30% chance happened, people said, oh, all the polls and models were wrong forever. It's like, no, they may have been correctly calibrated, and the less likely thing just happened. And so the media has a real trouble showing the genuine uncertainty of statistical predictions and the genuine uncertainty of trying to build a model about something. Doesn't mean building a model is impossible. It just means that it does not give you certainties, it gives you probabilities. Is money speech? Today and more on So the first thing we're going to talk about with interest groups is the difference between public interest groups and private interest groups. Public interest groups are things like Greenpeace or the Sierra Club or the NRA. That is, organizations whose membership is open to the public and who generally advocate for what they see as a public benefit that everyone should be able to have. They aren't for profit, and they try to influence policy for what they see as broadly distributed benefits. Private interest groups, on the other hand, are generally lobbyists and others representing narrow interests of, say, a business that is trying to achieve benefits in government policy that will accrue to themselves. So to put it simply, or to use an example, it's like the oil and gas lobby pushing for tax breaks on oil wells because they know they can make $40 billion a year if they get those tax breaks. That is a private interest attempting to secure private benefit, whereas public interests are attempting to secure a broadly distributed public benefit. So like education reform or a change in gun rights laws or increased environmental protections. But what are interest groups in general? Luckily, this isn't too complicated. It's kind of just in the name. It's just a group of people who are trying to influence the government to change policy in one direction or another. It's just a group of people who have an interest that they want to put forward. So you can think of this as an activist or a pressure group trying to change what the government does and how it enforces its laws and rules and what those laws and rules are. Often interest groups use lobbyists to meet with lawmakers. A lobbyist is like a paid expert at scheduling meetings with lawmakers. Lobbyists make their whole art the art of influencing politicians. And so you can just go rent a lobbyist and say, look, man, I think it's really important that like pink paint be banned. I really hate pink paint. And the lobbyist will say, what? And you'll say, just trust me, I'm gonna pay you and I want you to go advocate for the banning of pink paint or whatever it is that you despise. And the lobbyist will say, okay, it's, my fee's $180,000 for 6 months. And we get our money together and we go pay a lobbyist. And then that lobbyist would schedule meetings with lawmakers and try to say, look, I think, the scourges of, say, magenta and lilac colored paints are really underappreciated, and I really think we should. So that is how lobbying works. Lobbyists, remember, are a tool employed by interest groups in an attempt to get their policy positions adopted in government. It's money speech. So here's the basic problem. We have this thing called the First Amendment, you've heard of it, which prohibits government interfering with people's free expression, their free speech. Now, there are certain limits on the First Amendment. You cannot famously shout fire in a crowded theater. You cannot directly incite violence against someone. Those forms of expression are not protected by the First Amendment. Here's the question. Speech, we know, doesn't just refer to spoken words, because if a deaf person or someone who is mute were to express themselves using, say, American Sign Language, they would still be protected under the First Amendment. If you write something on a sign, that's protected under the First Amendment. If you publish a newspaper, that's protected under the First Amendment. So we know speech is not literal. They do not literally mean the sounds produced by passing air out of your mouth. How far does that extend, though? Is a performance art piece a form of speech? So far, people have generally said yes. Abstract performance art counts as expression, and you can't, go burn people's paintings. But here's where it gets tricky. Is spending money a form of free expression protected by the First Amendment? Specifically, is spending your money to support a political campaign a form of free political expression that's protected by the First Amendment? In 2010, the Supreme Court heard a case called Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, or Citizens United versus FEC. In this case,
basically what the court said is that corporations have First Amendment rights, at least the majority in this case said. Having said that, it said that First Amendment right trumps any danger that corporate money or union money has a corrupting influence in politics. Essentially, you had the 5 more conservative members of the court voting in favor of this of repealing this previous rule, and the 4 more liberal members on the other side. So it's in keeping with where the court has been on these things. And there was a group called Citizens United that had paid for, in essence, a corporation that had paid for a long video against Hillary Clinton, and it ran up against existing law and existing Supreme Court precedent. It challenged those. The court could have ruled on very narrow grounds and decided that no, this particular video didn't fit within the parameters of the law and would have given it leeway to do that. But instead, the court decided to use it as an opportunity to write this broader reversal of precedent.
The court held that the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from stopping corporations from spending money on political communication. That is a fancy way of saying if you are a corporation, then you are allowed to spend money as a form of protected speech to influence elections. And the logic behind this is that in some specific legal contexts, corporations count as people. That is, they have certain rights that are protected in the same way the rights of individual persons are protected. Now, in this case, spending money as a form of political expression is one of those protected rights. That is what the court found in Citizens United versus FEC. In practice, this has meant that corporations can funnel nearly unlimited amounts of money into US elections to try to influence the outcome of these elections. One of the ways they do this is through the formation of what are called super PACs. A PAC, or PAC, stands for Political Action Committee. And these super PACs can accept essentially unlimited contributions as long as they don't give them directly to a candidate, but instead spend them on, say, issue campaigns where they're trying to influence the outcome of an election. Now, in practice, this means that they can influence the outcome of an election or directly support a candidate just as effectively as if the money were being given directly to the candidate or to a closely allied organization, because they generally have a stake in the election and they know how to run issue ads that would influence people to vote for one candidate over another. So for example, you might form a super PAC called Veterans for Barack Obama. It could accept unlimited amounts of contributions from corporations, and you could run a bunch of ads implying that Obama's opponent in 2012, Mitt Romney, hates the troops, and then in so doing, cause Romney to lose votes and make it more likely that Obama would win the presidency in 2012. That's an example, but it's a very true-to-life example.
The coronavirus.
This is their new hoax.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China.
One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear. When you have 15 people, and within a couple of days it's going to be down to close to zero, we really think we've done a great job in keeping it down to a minimum.
I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised that I understand it.
No, I don't take responsibility at all.
Priorities USA Action is responsible for the content of this ad.
Money plays an incredibly important role. And the question here is whether and to what degree money should play this role in American politics. Is money just a form of speech or expression, or is money something that is accumulated in such a way as to actually distort or unbalance what makes a democracy work? Because one argument against this kind of unlimited spending is that the basic principle of democracy is one person, one vote. And if you can vote with your dollars, then suddenly it's not one person, one vote. It's how much money do you have? Oh, that's roughly proportional to how many votes you can influence. And so you are risking a society in which a person's influence over the democratic process is not determined by the fact that they are one citizen with one vote, but it's determined by how much money they have, who they know, and how they choose to spend their money.